continued throughout my life. I've experienced thousands of such moments. I've constantly been called a loser, defective, disgrace. But the most cruel was the mockery about my infertility and divorce. She looked up at the screen. To all viewers, many of you have had similar experiences. Emotional abuse from family is difficult to see and prove. That's why I launched Healing Hearts, to collect the voices of abused survivors and create a community to support them. At these words, Robert suddenly stood up. What nonsense! You've always tried to seek attention. You're ruining Victoria's special day. Margaret quietly laughed. Dad, I have 1 million followers on YouTube. My book will be published next month. I run a nationwide nonprofit organization. If I wanted attention, I would have had it long ago. The venue fell silent. Surprise spread across Robert and Evelyn's faces. They knew nothing about their daughter's success. You thought I was a low-wage clerk with a failed marriage and a defective woman who couldn't have children, Margaret said. That's because I let you think so, because I knew that if you knew about my success, you would try to ruin it. Her voice grew stronger. And what you know about David is also wrong. At that moment, the doors to the venue opened. A tall, confident man entered. It was David Clark. The once awkward young man had transformed into a sophisticated businessman. He walked straight toward Margaret. A murmur arose from the venue. Evelyn sank into her chair, and Robert blushed. David stood next to Margaret and placed his hand on her shoulder. Margaret, I didn't divorce you because you were infertile. I couldn't bear your family's abuse anymore, but that was my weakness. I'm sorry I left you alone. He looked around the venue. I am now the executive of a technology company. After divorcing Margaret, I was inspired by her courage. Seeing her recover from her family's abuse helped me rebuild my own life. He pointed at the screen. In fact, I've been secretly supporting Margaret's nonprofit organization for survivors of emotional abuse. I've been waiting for the day she would bravely stand up. Suddenly, several people stood up at the back of the venue. They were members of Margaret's online community. They nodded toward Margaret, showing their support. We are here with Margaret, one woman said. Her courage has given us the power to reclaim our own voices. Victoria stood frozen in her wedding dress. Her perfect day was crumbling. She looked at James, but he was staring into the distance with a confused expression. Margaret, why would you do this? She finally managed to say. This is my wedding. Margaret stared at her sister. You mocked my life in public for years. You've elevated yourself by hurting me. Today, you crossed a line, and I couldn't remain silent any longer. David took Margaret's hand. We've been gathering evidence and keeping records of years of emotional abuse by your family, and now Margaret is sharing the truth with millions of people. Tears glistened in Margaret's eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of liberation. The liberation of breaking years of silence and speaking the truth. She took a deep breath and spoke her next words. For a long time, I was made to believe I was worthless, but today, I reclaim my worth, and I send a message to all those in similar situations. You are not alone. Your voice has power, and it's never too late to speak the truth. David smiled beside her. The guilt he once felt for not protecting her had now turned into pride in her strength. Robert and Evelyn sat speechless. Their perfect facade had crumbled, crushed under the weight of truth. The venue was quiet, but in the online world, a storm was raging. Margaret's brave action had ignited the hearts of millions. As the venue was engulfed in chaos, Robert finally stood up. His face was red with anger, and the veins in his temples were bulging. This is completely inappropriate, he raised his voice. Margaret, you always want attention, always playing the victim. All of this is just exaggeration. No one in the family has ever hurt you. Margaret looked her father straight in the eye. Really? Then what is this? She tapped her smartphone and played a new recording. It contained the voice of 13-year-old Margaret and Robert shouting. You're just stupid. Why can't you be like Victoria? She's only 11, but already much smarter than you. You're a disgrace. Margaret, a disgrace to the Wilson family. When the recording ended, Robert was speechless. Evelyn stood up, trying to smooth over the situation. This is taken out of context. Robert was just being strict for Margaret's own good. We loved her. We were just trying to toughen her up. Margaret quietly shook her head. Love, when was the last time you hugged me? When did you ever celebrate my success? She pointed at the screen. Look, my channel helps millions of people. I've written books, given lectures, established a non-profit organization, but you never once said you were proud of me, because you didn't even know about my success. The atmosphere in the venue began to change. Many guests were expressing discomfort, and some were getting up to leave. James's parents, in particular, were visibly upset. James's father stood up. "What kind of farce is this? Is this the family we were trying to connect with?" Robert hurriedly tried to approach him, but he waved him away. "No thanks, I don't want to be involved in your family issues." Margaret, maintaining her composure, spoke her next words. "Everyone, this is not a farce, this is the truth, and I have legal measures prepared as well, a lawsuit for emotional abuse." She pointed at the screen of her smartphone, which displayed an email from a firm. "I've been collecting evidence for 2 years, and my lawyers say I have enough evidence. Preparations for a damages lawsuit for emotional abuse are complete." At these words, the color drained from Robert's face. As a real estate developer, he understood exactly what impact such a public scandal would have on his business. "Margaret, we're family," he suddenly said, changing his tone of voice. "Family matters should be resolved within the family." Margaret smiled. "Now you bring up the importance of family," she continued the live broadcast and looked at David. "We know what a real family is. It's not blood ties, but connections between people who respect and cherish each other." At that moment, an unexpected development occurred. James stood up and moved away from Victoria's side. Step by step, he approached Margaret. I don't intend to marry into such a family," he said, staring at Victoria. Victoria turned pale. "What are you saying? This is all lies. Margaret has always just been jealous." James shook his head. "I've seen how you talk about your sister these past few months, how much you despise her, and today, you've shown it in public. I don't want to spend my life with someone like that." He approached Margaret and stood before her. "I respect your courage. Thank you for becoming the voice of many people who have suffered abuse." The venue fell silent again. Victoria began to cry, her perfect makeup starting to smear. Margaret took a deep breath, preparing to reveal the final truth. "I must speak one more truth, about my divorce and infertility." She looked at David, who nodded. "I am not a failure. The divorce wasn't because David stopped loving me, but because he couldn't stand up for me." David nodded sadly. "I was weak. Seeing Margaret's family hurt her, I couldn't protect her, and I ran away from that guilt. It was the biggest mistake of my life." Margaret continued. "And let me reveal the truth about infertility." She hesitated for a moment, but quickly steeled her resolve. "According to the doctor's diagnosis, it wasn't me who was infertile, but Victoria, who inherited Dad's DNA." At these words, a murmur arose from the venue. Victoria shuddered, and all color drained from her face. Victoria cried out, "That's a lie." Margaret said quietly. "When I had tests done, the doctor said there was no problem with my reproductive ability. But what about you, Victoria? I know you and James have been trying to conceive, and failing. It's a medical fact. Dad's DNA abnormality is only passed to female children." At this truth bomb, Robert sank into his chair, trembling. His secret, his DNA defect, something he had always hidden, was now public. Victoria stared at her parents. "Is this true?" Evelyn couldn't say anything, she just covered her face with her hands. This was a truth she hadn't known either. Margaret said quietly. "After I got divorced, you forced me to accept the label of being defective, but in reality, the defect was elsewhere." The venue was completely engulfed in silence. James moved away from Victoria and headed toward his parents. The Anderson family was preparing to leave together. Margaret finally turned the camera toward the viewers and addressed them. "The truth can sometimes be painful, but it is the truth that sets us free. Today, I spoke my truth, and by doing so, I have become free." David held her hand and stood by her side. Members of Margaret's online community gathered around her, forming a circle of support. It was a true turning point in Margaret's life.